On February 5, 2015, practicing tactics that were already honed, namely a counterattack in response to shelling, Ukrainian armed forces entered the so-called Avdiivka industrial zone. Facing relatively weak resistance, the intelligence groups of the 58th Brigade, 16th Battalion and separate 74th Reconnaissance Battalion were eventually able to gain a foothold in their positions. As a result, the front line shifted by just a few hundred meters, but having gained fire control over the Horlivka-Donetsk highway, the Ukrainian army seriously complicated logistics for the militants. At the same time, observing the active maneuvers of Ukrainian units in the southern part of the ATO zone, the militants concentrated considerable forces in the area around the town of Torres. Seeing the advancing area around Avdiivka as a maneuver to distract, Kremlin strategists missed the point, didn't react properly to the actions of the Ukrainian avant-garde, and as a result, deceived themselves. This is episode 82 of the series History of the War. In the spring of 2014, the Russian Federation annexed Crimea, and in the summer there was an invasion of eastern Ukraine. As a result of a chain of battles, this advance was halted, but the war did not end. Diplomacy and espionage, economics, propaganda, and fighting – all these are elements of a hybrid war, and we're trying to figure it out. On February 6th, it was, as per tradition, absolutely quiet in Luhansk region. At the same time, fighting was taking place in the Horlivka and Donetsk directions, and around Mayorsk, Zaitsevo and Novhorodsk. The militants regularly used heavy weaponry. At the same time, shelling took place day and night. This ultimately caused a sane response from the Ukrainian side, which meant extra work for gunners. The vicinity of Donetsk airport literally rattled. Ukrainian positions in Krasnohorivka were repeatedly fired on from mortars. A similar situation was observed in the area of Hnutove and Talakivka. Militants opened fire in Shirokino for the first time in a long time. Snipers were busy. In the space of 24 hours, 11 Ukrainian soldiers received injuries of varying severity. On the same day, near Orikhovo village, Popasna district of Luhansk region, officers of the Security Service of Ukraine detained a member of a ghost gang. During interrogation, one militant testified that he was recruited by Russian special services in 2014. Was a signalman, who also served as a spotter of artillery fire. The amount of shelling of Ukrainian positions on February 7th fell by almost half. 47 cases of violation of no-firing regime were recorded. The epicenter of hostilities remained the outskirts of Donetsk, where in the area of Avdiivka mine, and in the suburbs of Avdiivka, where there was fighting around the clock. The most active terrorists appeared near Krasnohorivka. Ukrainian positions were hit by 82 and 120 mm mortars after midnight from Staromikhailivka, and in fact, this shelling only ended at dawn. In this case, the militants fired on positions held by ATO forces for over 75 minutes. The militants used mortars around Horlivka, and grenade launchers and airborne weapons of infantry fighting vehicles around Troitske. It should be remembered that any case of use of weapons also involves firing from various small arms. During the day, one Ukrainian soldier was wounded by sniper fire, and one soldier of the 24th Brigade was killed around Trohizbenka when a mine exploded. At the same time, aerial reconnaissance by Russian terrorist forces was stepped up significantly. In just one day, 11 flights by unmanned reconnaissance vehicles were recorded, with one seen over the town of Shastya. Such activity has explainable reasons. War is the path of deception. When planning an attack, any competent military leader will seek to divert the attention of the enemy by conducting several false attacks. As to the advance in Avdiivka as a maneuver to distract, terrorist commanders were in no hurry to throw large forces into battle, but sought to get as much information as possible about the number and movements of Ukrainian troops along the entire front line. The next day, the picture of the confrontation changed very little. With relative silence in Luhansk region, the vicinity of Horlivka and Donetsk, as well as the Marinka-Krasnohorovka district, remained areas of increased tension, where in addition to small arms and grenade launchers, mortars were also actively used. It is worth reminding that since the spring of 2014, the constant presence of Russian troops along the state border forced Ukrainian commanders to disperse their forces. In fact, the invasion in Ukraine began with so-called sudden verification of the combat readiness of troops. Already in the summer of 2014, at a time when anti-terrorist operation forces almost defeated the militants, several Russian units crossed the state border and restored the balance of forces, inflicting a series of defeats on the Ukrainian army. On February 8, 2016, on the occupied part of the Crimean Peninsula, in close proximity to the territory controlled by Ukraine, Russian troops deployed rocket and artillery into battle formations. At the same time, so as to cover their maneuvers, Russian soldiers installed a smoke screen using special equipment. According to intelligence reports, troops of the southern and central military districts of Russia, units of the airborne troops and transport aviation were put on full alert under the guise of military exercises in southern Russia, and on the territory of the Crimean Peninsula, 8,500 people, 900 pieces of military equipment, 200 aircraft and helicopters, and 50 ships were involved. General Gerasimov, Chief of General Staff of the Russian Army, arrived in Crimea. All these actions by Russian troops were nothing more than a response to recent Ukrainian exercises, a method of intimidation and pressure. In simple words, the Kremlin strongly recommended that Ukraine refrain from an offensive around Mariupol area. However, it should be noted that following the Minsk agreements, the Ukrainian command did not plan any large-scale offensives. On February 8th, officers of the Security Service of Ukraine received evidence of cooperation with terrorists from officers of the Russian group of the Joint Center for Monitoring and Coordinating Ceasefire Issues. Several servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation had on their person medals and award sheets of the Donetsk People's Republic, which is proof of cooperation between Russian officers and militants. A reminder that the Russian military at the Ceasefire Center should record cases of ceasefire violations and the use of heavy weapons, but not help either side. Besides, the very fact of the presence of authorized Russian officers in the group is designed to avoid a situation where the Russian leadership does not recognize any of the results of the group's observations. Put simply, if the militants use heavy weapons and the Russian officers record this fact, the Kremlin leadership won't be able to accuse observers of bias. In fact, the presence of Russian officers in the monitoring group led to a real, not declarative, decrease in the amount of shelling. On February 9th, Ukrainian positions around Stanitsa Luhanska were subjected to a single shelling from a mortar in the Donetsk direction. The militants acted more actively, and the area of Mayorsk and Zaitsevo became the epicenter of the confrontation, and in the latter case, the terrorists fired in several directions simultaneously. It was also uneasy in the area around the Svetlodarsk Arc, Marinka, Avdiivka, Talakivka, and Shirokina. Despite the round-the-clock firing, the militants used heavy weapons only 4 times. At the same time, terrorists used an automatic grenade launcher to fire at the Marinka checkpoint from Alexandrovka village. The shells exploded in the immediate vicinity of the point, where there were civilians. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. As a result of return fire by the Ukrainian army, the shelling ceased quite quickly. But a tragedy took place the next morning, not far from the Marinka checkpoint. Traveling from occupied territories, the driver of a car ignored warning signs and pulled over to the side of the road, where the car was blown up by a mine. The explosion caused the death of 3 passengers in the car, and 1 more person died on the way to hospital. Within a few hours, in the same area, a terrorist sabotage group attempted to cross the demarcation line. The Ukrainian military fired on saboteurs, forcing them to retreat, but the Marinka checkpoint stopped its work for half an hour. Unlike absolutely quiet Luhansk region, the situation in Donetsk region remained difficult. The militants were active in the areas around Avdiyivka, Shirokine and Marinka. 9 cases of the use of mortars by terrorists were recorded. The fiercest hostilities were in Zaitsev and Mayorsk. Medium-intensity battles did not stop on the entire front from Troitsk to Pisky. The majority of shelling of the positions held by anti-terrorist operation forces took place in the evening. A total of 3 Ukrainian soldiers were injured on February 10th. Carrying out a combat mission in the area of Avdiivka, a serviceman of the 3rd Special Forces Regiment, Sergeant Oleg Sizonenko, tripped on a mine and died. A senior soldier of the 131st Reconnaissance Battalion, Roman Vasilenko, died in a Zaporizhia hospital from acute pneumonia on that day. On February 11th, the militants systematically broke the no-firing regime along the entire front line in Donetsk region. It is logical that this prompted an appropriate reaction from the Ukrainian army. Traditionally, the outskirts of Horlivka and Donetsk, where fighting took place literally around the clock, became hotspots of confrontation. During a mortar attack on Zaitsev, a local resident was injured in his own yard. He was promptly evacuated and taken to Toretsk Hospital. There were 12 cases of shelling in Marinka, mainly from grenade launchers. In Krasnohorivka, the militants fired simultaneously from a mortar and anti-aircraft gun Zu-23. Within the space of 30 minutes, the invaders also occasionally violated the no-firing regime east of Mariupol at once on several sections of the front. On the same day, law enforcement officers found in a cache 2 anti-tank grenade launchers, 4 handheld cumulative grenades, 11 F1 grenades, and more than 1,500 rounds of various calibers. The find was made in the backyard of a private house in Dmitrov village, Donetsk region. On February 12th, terrorists actively used mortars in the area of Krymsky, Novozvanivka, Talakivka, as well as in the area around Donetsk airport, where Ukrainian positions near the village of Pisky were hit. Heavy mortar fire was also observed in the area of Krasnohorivka and Marinka, where due to shelling, the checkpoint had to be temporarily closed. In total, the militants fired about 200 tons of mortar mines a day, though in fact these expenses did not affect the combat capabilities of the hybrid army. According to intelligence, in the first week of February, 200 tons of various ammunition arrived in Hartsisk by rail from Russia. 240 tons of diesel fuel and 3 platforms of military hardware were delivered to Ilovaisk, and up to 300 tons of ammunition to Luhansk. Many military and diplomatic processes take place simultaneously. They influence each other, make adjustments to develop plans, and are transformed on the fly. And when viewed from above, the result is a colorful strategic picture, with hundreds of pieces of equipment, cunning maneuvers, large-scale exercises, and thousands of people involved. Ukraine, training its defenses, carried out a hybrid offensive. The Kremlin, on the contrary, playing visually with steel muscles, conducted a hybrid defensive operation. But as always, one detail was left behind the scenes. While the Kremlin strategists opposed in every way the likely Ukrainian attack on the Sea of Azov, Ukrainian soldiers dug trenches and built fortifications in the Avdiivka industrial zone by using improvised means. A competent commander understands that a soldier who's taken up new positions needs time to gain a foothold in them. Ukrainian soldiers did get this golden time in February 2016.